And we're recording. So again, guys, be careful. Well, people, be careful. Anything you don't want recorded, you probably shouldn't say. So again, this is the October 1st meeting of SIG Apps, and I believe we had one announcement to start with, which was if you've been given an invitation to vote for the steering committee, you should consider doing so soon. I believe voting closes in the very near future. It's an important thing. This is your community, and you should take ownership of, who steers that community and who runs it. So please get out there and vote. Let's see. So we didn't have any demos today, unfortunately. We do have some workloads items to discuss, and we wanted to talk a little bit about application status as well. So for application status, what we've been discussing about recently, and we'll open a proposal for it shortly, is kind of what Matt Butcher originally suggested on the KEP when it first started. And we could aggregate the status of all of the known workloads and things that actually have status into the application itself. So that would just mean doing things like inspecting the status of deployments, inspecting the status of Staplesets, replica sets, probably not as much if they're managed by a deployment, but if they're not and your application selects them directly, then those as well. Replication controllers, and then kind of ending them together. So if all of them are not green, then the application is not green. The status wouldn't be healthy. We're also considering, and this kind of runs into a workloads conversation, what we might do with the workloads API to make readiness more consistent across the surface. And not just with respect to the workloads API, but for the entire API. So with deployment, we have conditions, and the conditions are actually used, and you can pretty much get the readiness of a deployment by inspecting the conditions along with potentially inspecting some of the replication information. For Stapleset and daemon set, you would probably have to inspect the status directly and just look at, are the replicas ready? And we're also giving some thought to, like, what does that actually mean? And does that differ for deployments and Staplesets in any way? Like, for a deployment, you can set max unavailability, which kind of indicates, like, I'm willing to tolerate this much. For a Stapleset, it's almost like if it's under replicated in any way, you're probably not 100% green. Like, all those pods should be running or something's probably wrong. Daemon set has some of the similar semantics. So we're trying to figure out exactly how to aggregate status there. And we want to open a kind of proposal against application status for that and implement that in a controller. Some of the other components of the system don't really have status, like config map doesn't have any status, basically any structured data objects, config maps and secrets. And then the status of services is kind of weird. It does have a status object, but that really only communicates, like, for a load balance service, the IP address that's been assigned by the cloud provider or by the underlying networking implementation that does the load balancing. For status of the service itself, you'd really want to inspect the endpoint subsets, I guess, and then look at if all of those endpoint subsets are ready. So there is a notion of having ready endpoints or ready addresses and unready addresses, if I remember the terminology correctly. So that might be something we're interested in doing as well. The really interesting piece, I think, comes with CRDs. So a couple of guys on the API machinery side are looking at what does that mean for CRDs? Like, is there a way that we can have standard conventions for a CRD that's like something like, let's say, an etcd cluster that communicates status in a way that's interpreted, it can be interpreted generically? And this isn't just for Kubernetes applications, but this might also be useful for any other tool that wants to try to interact well with things that generally are related to creating workloads and also communicate a status. So has anybody else been thinking about this or think it's valuable or want to participate in this conversation?
Me? I've definitely been thinking about this. I think you've thought about it a lot more than I have at this point. But I'm in the operator pattern world right now, and also thinking about like with CRDs that represent a deployed something, what are the appropriate things to put in the status? How can it be useful? How do you aggregate statuses in this, across multiple resources into something that's useful and generate value from that? So I'm definitely interested in that topic.
Okay. So there's only a couple of people participating right now, but we'd like to get broader feedback. So the intention is to open up an issue against the application repository. And I believe there's one for status there already, but we wanted to kind of offer an initial proposal and get feedback generally from people if they think this is useful or if they agree that the aggregation pattern is right.
Hi, can you post a link to it? I would be interested.
Okay. When we open the issue, I will put a link into SIG Apps mailing list.
Another feedback I had was, I think this is quite useful. I've been working with MySQL operator, and it's kind of weird because even though the stateful set is up and running, the MySQL replicas might be lagging behind each other. So we use a separate thing called orchestrator to figure that out. And it would be nice if it all becomes, like Kubernetes becomes a source of truth.
That would be cool. Which MySQL operator are you using?
I use this operator from Press Labs. It's called MySQL operator.
Is it the one from Oracle?
No.
Okay.
This is Percona-based operator.
This is the Percona one. Okay, cool.
And another feedback I had was, I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt your train of thought.
Right. Yeah, but I think that will be really awesome if Kubernetes becomes like one place where you can just get to see. Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about was, would Kubernetes do something about it? Like if replicas are lagging, would Kubernetes delay the decisions for rescheduling the pods?
That's going to be, so Kubernetes itself doesn't have insight into the individual replication topology. If you're using like a MySQL operator that's using Percona to stand up replicated MySQL using, I guess, InnoDB, we're not going to have insight into that. We could maybe provide better hooks in order to try to stop the rollout, but generally the responsibility of the controller, of the operator itself, is to manage that rollout and to detect when it's under replicated, when the replication topology is broken, and to fix it.
Okay. So, yeah, that's all I had.
Okay. All right. If there's nothing else on this, we can move over to some of the stuff with the workloads API. Give me a second. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So there are a couple of interesting feature proposals and some interesting things around stateful set. One of them is max surge min available, right? So in general, deployment has the notion of max surge and max unavailable because it's kind of a heuristic in terms of how it rolls out pods, right? Like it can burst ahead in order to say, okay, well, I'm going to create 3 or 4 extra replicas while I'm turning down the other replica set. And it can say like, well, if you don't have this many available, then just stop. We don't have that semantic with Stapleset. And initially it really didn't make sense because of how Stapleset works. Like generally speaking, in the default operation, it's going to go one at a time and wait for each pod that's a predecessor to become ready before starting the successor, and then block if one fails. For a lot of distributed systems, that really doesn't matter so much. Like for Zookeeper and etcd, for instance, when you turn them up, the pods are able to conform consensus via leader election. And a lot of these systems actually, in order to facilitate leader election, have identity built in, and then the pods are able to actually just form a quorum on their own. So there's no real reason to lag. So then we added burst mode to support that, right? So this is for Zookeeper, for instance. You can launch all 3 to 5 Zookeeper servers that are going to be in the quorum. And because you've configured them with an ID for the individual server and the ID for all other servers in order for them to form quorum in the first place, they can just come up in parallel and find each other and form a quorum. But we don't have max surge and min unavailable for that, right? So it's kind of either we'll burst you all in parallel or we'll do ordered sequential rollout. And those are the only two options. So I just wanted to bring this issue up and see, because there's not a lot of people who have said anything about it, but I wanted to see if there was more interest in doing this, and just kind of make people aware that someone's thinking about it and that it might be something we could consider doing if people are really interested in it, or if there's value. Like if there are any use cases people can think of that are explicit as to why they might need this feature, it might help motivate moving it forward a little bit more. And does anyone comments or thoughts? Okay, nope.
I can give a quick +1 to that. I definitely have some workloads that, I don't care about the order in which the pods come up. I'd like for them to all spin up as quickly as possible, and the application knows how to handle the topology that's just by looking at its own pod name.
So, but you can do that now with burst mode, right? So burst says go all in parallel. This would be to add, to basically add a throttle on it so that like if you have X availability, stop tearing it down, or only do 3 in parallel, only do 5 in parallel. For deployments, it probably matters a lot more because they tend to be quite a bit larger than quorum formers that you'd run inside of a Stapleset. Like for etcd, I think the max you run is maybe 11 before it starts degrading horribly. I forget which one it is or what the exact limits are. For Zookeeper, after 7, you start seeing performance downgrading unless you start using observers. So a lot of strongly consistent systems, which generally are the thing this applies to, they don't grow too huge. And even things that use it, like Kafka, for instance, leverages Zookeeper for its own consensus protocol. You can launch your Kafka brokers in parallel and be pretty safe, but how many do people generally want to launch in parallel simultaneously? And what's the largest Kafka clusters out there that are usually managed individually are in the tens, not like hundreds, let alone thousands. So if burst rollout works there, do we need to throttle it? Like, I don't know. I just don't have any use cases that I'm aware of where it makes a lot of sense, but given the issue's open, I kind of think that there's something out there that I'm missing. So
what about auto scaling for Staplesets?
So you'd want to burst for auto scaling. So auto scaling for Staplesets is kind of complicated, right? Like you'd probably need to do it with custom metric support as opposed to just doing it off of duty cycle or memory utilization. Like Cassandra would be an example where if you do it based on mem utilization or duty cycle, compaction, for instance, would trigger you to scale up. And you wouldn't want to do that. That's just going to probably make you worse off. I could think like if you did it for MySQL and you were using uniformly replicated, not clustered MySQL, that could probably work if you were looking to increase read fan out. But you'd actually have to make sure that you were scaling up based on read fan out and not write pressure, right? Like if all of the traffic is write pressure going to the master, and then you start spinning up more read replicas, then you have to replicate even further to push more data to a new replica for read. You continuously scale up, and you're not actually taking any pressure off of the cluster. So I don't know if it's super trivial to do, or if bursts more than better custom metrics integration for particular solutions would save you on that. But I'm curious, are people using auto scaling with Stapleset?
Not that I know of. I'm not that familiar with it though.
There have been requests, and I've seen people want to do it for Memcached in particular and Redis, where, I mean, Memcache, it probably does make a lot of sense to do it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a use case with Redis where you would have pod 0 be the leader and then have any number of replicas, and you'd be able to auto scale reads. And then you would want some kind of some way to define that behavior of how much availability you have as you're scaling up and down.
Yeah, but so usually for scale up, right? Like, you're not going to decrease your availability as you would be scaling up the Stapleset. You would just add more nodes, and the max and min that you would scale up to and down from would probably be based just on the auto scale configuration, not so much the max unavailable or max surge or max unavailable. But are you saying maybe from a greediness perspective, like you don't want it to scale up, to jump up instantaneously to like 10 pods?
I was really just throwing that out there. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, if anybody has thoughts or wants to +1 or -1 or add comments, please check the issue out. Then another thing we had come up is we removed the Reapers from kubectl, I believe in 110 going into 111.
Yeah.
And it didn't actually change. So this says Stapleset delete behavior changed. It's not entirely accurate. The delete behavior for Stapleset itself didn't change, but the delete for kubectl with respect to Stapleset changed. Previously, what the Reapers would do is scale the Stapleset down to 0 for you prior to actually doing a delete. So regardless of whether you did foreground or background propagation, what would end up happening is you're actually going to scale the Stapleset down. You're going to get the ordered graceful termination that you get with a scale down, and then it deletes it. Now it's just issuing a delete. And what that ends up looking like is a full parallel delete. There's some comments here that we never intended for ordered graceful termination on delete, which is true. We didn't implement that from a controller side, but it was a semantic that was provided by kubectl. And a lot of people use kubectl in scripting to interface with the system for their automation. So there is an expectation that's kind of changed there. The kind of feedback we're looking for here is, so we know what's happened, and we have ideas around how we might fix it or change it, because it would be a change. What we want to know is it valuable to do so? Were people depending on this? Do people want this? Is it something we should go do? We could probably we could have the controller interact with finalizers on the pods in order to actually make this happen server side, which is where, if we were going to do it, we should have done it in the first place. And if there's interest in it, we'd like feedback on, like, okay, this is important to us as a community. You guys should go do this.
So I think one of the important things to note here, right, is that kubectl taking this out was a non-backwards compatible change, right? That for somebody's experience, it was a breaking change, right? And that catches me. I mean, it's one of those frustrating points that people complain about when you're upgrading versions of Kubernetes. Some of these kinds of things change in non-backwards compatible. We definitely don't follow semantic versioning and releasing this stuff. We're very loose with that. And so I just want to point out that this is one of those cases where that happened, right?
Well,
was there like a,
right? Because it's not even you upgraded your cluster. You upgraded your kubectl.
Yeah.
You upgraded a command line client and it broke your workflow. So there's that.
Right there. Like, do we know what kind of conversations had around making that kind of change? Right? Because that's just
Yeah,
it's just frustrating.
it was a very, very long conversation that was over a period of years, and we never actually wanted to have the Reapers. The Reapers were in Kubectl kind of as a necessity because certain things weren't even available server side when they initially launched. And the Reapers were actually kind of slightly broken in their own way. So then when we got garbage collection and various forms of delete semantics in, I don't know, maybe it's a 1617, we kind of carefully started thinking about removing the Reapers over a period of a couple of years. So it was a change that was a long time in the making, but I think when they ripped it out, they didn't fully consider that it wouldn't be completely transparent in the case of Stapleset with the scale down. Now, there is a valid workaround. You can just scale it to 0 and then wait till it goes to 0 and then delete it, which actually is it gives you a little bit more control if you do it that way. If ordered termination is something that's valuable, one of the things was that most people who are deleting the Stapleset aren't deleting it because they want to, they need it to go out gracefully. They're deleting it to get rid of it. Unless you're doing a non-cascading delete, which is a slightly different thing. But non-cascading delete is well supported and nothing's changed there. So I can see why people are like, it's probably not, like, based on the promises that are actually made for Stapleset, technically we didn't break anything in terms of what we promised, but it is still a change in the tool that has an observable effect to end users. So, I mean, the question to me from here is, do we want to make that easier again? Is it worth adding the finalizer integration into Stapleset to enable this behavior in a single way? Because it would really technically be a feature from the workloads API side as opposed to a bug fix. And, again, it's something we're talking about, but if we're going to go do it, it would be something that we'd want feedback from end users first in terms of, like, this is valuable to us. It's something you should go do.
Part of me says I really like the idea of maybe implementing this kind of thing in a generic way, right? Like a hook. Like you could have a hook that says pre-delete, go scale it down, because then you could define your own custom rules per application. And this almost seems like a nice case for a pre-delete hook where you could write what you want it to be rather than building the feature right in to the scheduler.
Well,
maybe that's just me.
It would be a finalizer in the controller, but a more general hook across the entire API surface might be valuable. But that's another conversation with SIG architecture, because they're still at a place where it's like, go figure out what lifecycle hooks are actually there across the API surface, and tell us a good story about that before we let you add any more. But agreed. At any rate, I want to make people aware, and then if people want to leave comments, feedback, or request it as a feature and say it's valuable, that would help drive decisions as to whether we do it or not. And then this last one, which is also Stapleset. So can't roll back from a broken state. This is sort of true, but it's not a bug. It would be a feature. When we rolled out with Stapleset, we tried to do the safest thing possible, which is if something is broken, user has to intervene to unbreak themselves before we start automating anything again, because we don't want to automate things that make your life worse, right? Effectively, we took let's do what's absolutely safest, which is generally, if you're a student of robotics, if you do the safe thing, the robot never moves. Same thing for a controller. The safest thing to do is nothing. So if you have like an error in your Stapleset and then you try to roll back to a previous known good state, you have to fix your error before rolling back to the good state. We don't have to do it that way. Like this is a feature that I could see a lot of people would want, being able to automate rollbacks if your Stapleset is broken. We could totally implement detection that, okay, what you're really attempting to do is roll back to a previously known good state. Like you're within the revision history of the Stapleset and you just want to reapply it to get healthy again and not block on that rollback. That's something that's totally doable. So again, there's only like 4 comments here. One from Anthony, who's kind of basically saying like, yeah, we probably just did this to be safe. But if we want to move forward with this, it would be good to get some signals and some feedback from the people in SIG apps and our end users to say, yeah, this would be hugely valuable. Can you go do this? Like the interest that we get on GitHub is one way that we prioritize what features we go ahead and do, because we want to spend our time doing things that are most valuable to the end user. So again, if this is something that people are very interested in doing, it would be good to get feedback on like, yeah, you guys should go do this. And the last thing was, so we're still have one area of the API surface that's in beta, which is cron job. Jobs GA, the rest of the workloads API is GA. Cron job is still beta. So I just kind of wanted to get a feeling on how important is it to people to move it to GA, and how, like, are people using it? How happy are people with it?
Well, I'll speak up real quick here. I use it. I've got stuff running in it all the time, and I haven't had any problems with it. Like many people who were treating beta stuff as GA and running production on it, I think it's in use today. And so my question is, what's stopping it from being moved to GA?
Mostly bugs.
Do we have a list of like GA blocker bugs somewhere for it?
Yeah, I don't have it on hand, but for sure. And then like the other thing is, because it's based on job, there were some things we wanted to get in for job first as well. Janet recently got a PR merged for TTL for job so we could stop. So one thing about job is people tend to create lots of them and not necessarily think about how they might clean those jobs up. And it causes lots of pressure on people's control planes, both on Google's cloud, on everywhere else that I've seen. So it's not an issue that's unique to any one Kubernetes installation. It's kind of like a global thing. So we wanted to try to get the TTL and garbage collection in for job first before we GA something that its job is basically to create a lot of jobs repetitively. But now cron job also does have its own garbage collection kind of built in. And just the other thing is kind of making sure the garbage collection and the cleanup that's in cron job is robust as well. And it seems to be like, I haven't seen a lot of feedback where it's like cron job is breaking my cluster. And there's been some active community contribution around it too, which is cool. So I guess like what it comes down to is we as a community kind of have to decide, is it really GA ready? Like the SIG apps think it's GA ready.
Another blocker is that we want to change the implementation to use Informer framework.
That's one of the
to
open
improve
bugs.
the efficiency.
Yeah. But do we want to do that for job and cron job or just cron job?
I think job already
We moved it?
does that.
Didn't originally. I could imagine we've done it by now though.
Yeah, but then we definitely want to do that for cron job before it becomes GA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this the kind of thing we could shoot for in the next release or the following release? Like say, okay, a lot of people are using cron job today. Let's go round it out and get it GA. Is that something I know folks are busy in this next release cycle, some folks more than others. Is this the kind of thing we can get done in the next release cycle and actually shoot for? Or
To promote to GA in the next release cycle? I don't know if we can actually feasibly get it in the next release, but I think we could get it in the next 2. But we'd have to decide now that it's important and then go load up all of the work to go do that.
Because a lot of people are using it and treating it as GA, as something you're just going to go use, I would suggest we do it. because, I mean, if we've kind of got it's beta, but then lots of people are treating it as GA, and we're like, well, there's a bunch of bugs and rough edges, but then lots of people are using it, right? It's that kind of thing of if people are actually using it and wanting it to be GA, can we go meet them where that's at and help it get to GA?
And I suppose, and then the other thing is, I haven't seen a lot of feedback that the API is bad, except for the one thing that people wanted with the time zone support, which we decided we're not going to do just because it changes the nature of what a Kubernetes distribution is from a binary level, because it requires you to port an IANA database into your cluster.
It requires you to deal with time zones, which are a mess.
Yeah, which are a mess, right? So we decided we're not doing that. So from an API perspective, it seems pretty stable to me.
Yeah,
I don't see anything that's broken with the API fundamentally.
No, and I've been using it, and I haven't had issues with it. But I'm not excessively using it. I'm using it for tasks that happen, once, twice, few times a day. That's about it. Nothing excessive, and I haven't had any issues with it, and the APIs work fine for me. But I'm just one data point.
Yeah, we're using it in production, and we're running. I mean, we have cron jobs that run every few minutes, and haven't had any problems there. So.
Yeah, and isn't it? Was it? I'm sorry, I don't know where you're at. Is it Stripe that's built a system on top of it?
Stripe uses it. They contributed back to it. I don't know if they've built an entire system on top of it. And I know they've gotten into Kubernetes significantly off of Mesos, but
yeah, they have. So what they did, and so this says where it is. They needed a system to run cron jobs, and so they didn't want developers to do it, so they built another thing on top of it that gets converted to cron jobs.
Okay. So they previously were using Kronos, but I think Kronos is kind of dead. But not Kubernetes, Mesos Kronos.
Yeah, here I will.
And I think in their journey on to Kubernetes, it became, we got to do something else here. So
yeah, I just dropped a link into chat here. And if you actually just search for cron job in there, it shows up a couple of times. You're going to see what they're depending on. And so you see some people are depending on this for production environments. They built a system on top of it to make it easier for developers to specify what they want and not have to know the whole cron job spec. But they're depending heavily on it, it says here. And I'm sure others are too. So because people are relying on it, it's probably something worth us taking to GA.
Yep. Okay, so that's all I had on Workloads API this week. And we have about 20 minutes left for open discussion. So does anybody have any topics they'd like to bring up? Okay, I will take silence for a no. In that case, we'll give you back 18 minutes of your Monday morning. And
Sorry,
okay.
Something. So I've been using this local volume provisioner in Kubernetes with Stapleset. And what happens is if a node goes down, because the volume is it's pinned to a node, when that node goes down, the stateful set doesn't recover from that failure. One of the replicas remains wondering if anybody has experienced that before and would have sort of solutions to this problem.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. You're using a local volume provisioner that's basically using are you using local PVs and local PVCs, or are you using regular PVs with a local provisioner that's just taking a chunk of node and storing it locally, and then the volume effectively disappears and the node dies?
Correct. So it's one of the add-ons in Kubernetes, and what that does is it on a schedule it keeps discovering the volumes that are configured on a node, basically just looks at a directory and whatever mount points are present in that directory to present that as volumes to Kubernetes. And once you make a claim that basically the volume provisioner acts first, and then Kubernetes scheduler provisions the pod on that node where the volume is present.
I see. So you're using local PVCs as well. So you're actually using local PVCs. This is the new feature that storage just got to beta. I think this time it was 11 or 112, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And you're saying that the node dies, the Stapleset can never reschedule?
Correct. Yeah, because sort of a weird chicken and egg problem where the volume can't come up because it's tied to the node, and then the pod cannot come up because it's tied to that volume.
So if the node dies and you have a local volume provisioner, why doesn't it provision new storage? That was the workflow that I understood was implemented.
Because the volume claim is tied to that particular volume, and the volume is tied to the node, right? So
okay, so the PVC never unbinds even though the node disappears.
Right.
So
I can tell you what I'm doing today. I basically just have a cron job which looks at these things and then goes and deletes the corresponding pod and the volume claim, and then basically the new replica comes up on somewhere else and starts replicating from scratch.
So if you use a cron job, that's fine, but that's what I was basically going to suggest. I don't even know if you have to delete the pod itself, but if you delete the PVC, you should get a new PVC created, and you'll unbind from the volume claim and you'll come back up. What I'll take as an action item is to go talk to Saad and Michelle from the SIG storage side. When we initially discussed this feature, I thought there was supposed to be a timeout after which you would get an unbind if the node's dead and never comes back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me talk to them and see what their thinking was on that, because that wasn't my understanding of how the failure use case would work. I would understand why they didn't do anything else in that, and maybe it might always be that if you lose a node and effectively the PVC can no longer bind, they're going to make you do it manually again, because that's the safest thing you can do. At that point, like if they make a decision to heuristically unbind a PVC from a local volume due to node failure, in the general case, that could lead to data loss, right? Depending on what the individual's use case is. So the answer may be that this is the way it was intended to work, and we expect a manual intervention in all cases. But there may be something that's either coming down the pipe or that allows you to configure the system in order to say, okay, well, this node has been down for X amount of time. I want you to unbind the volume from the PVC because we don't expect it to ever come back.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I can take an action item to talk to the SIG storage guys about what their plan is there and the limitations of the current implementation.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay.
I just put a link in the chat. I would love it if I could get really quick feedback on this PR to add a pod ordinal label to pods in a Stapleset. First of all, just whether a label or an annotation makes more sense. And then
I think we already added this.
We have a pod name label.
Oh, okay. Oh, you want to add an ordinal directly. Right.
And we could take this into Slack too, but.
So I can give you some feedback on whether do you intend this to be So labels are usually used for selecting things. The reason the name label is there, which you can get the ordinal from, is because there's a pattern where somebody creates one service per pod in a stateful set in order to expose a distributed system where you need to access the members of the stateful set individually outside of the cluster using a load balance service, right? Which is why it's a label. If the annotation is meant to be something that's only processed by machines, if it's not meant to be selectable, then it should be an annotation. If you have a use case where you actually want to try to select pods by ordinal, which I don't see I don't understand why you would want to do that, but I'm not saying there is no use case for it. Then a label would make more sense. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, it does. And I did outline one use case. It's really, it doesn't make a lot of sense for everyday use, I don't think. But if you have multiple stateful sets working together in some way, it may be nice. For example, if you're representing a sharded database and each shard is its own stateful set, then you might want to select across each of those stateful sets by the pod ordinal.
Okay. I mean, I don't strongly object to having an annotation. I think we should. I mean, it seems like it's generally, I can spend some time with this. I think you're still going to have to address Clayton's feedback though.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, then 10 minutes back to the room. All right, guys, thanks for coming out and see you next week.